India's Border Security Force, or the BSF, has released dramatic unseen footage of how Pakistan forward posts covering fire to attempted infiltrations were ravaged. This is only part of the recent hours that have seen dramatic new footage released by the army as well. We now have the war room, images of what was happening in the war room on the night of Operation Sindoor's first strikes. This, as the Prime Minister in Gujarat has now given multiple warnings to Pakistan, including saying that what Pakistan does vis-a-vis its patronage of terrorism can no longer be called a proxy war. I'm Barkha Dutt. You're with the Mojo story. On the program today, the BSF has released dramatic unseen footage. You can see some of that footage there in the video screen, on your screen, in those videos that have been released by the Border Security Force. This is BSF action against Pakistan forward posts that have provided cover for attempted infiltration by terrorists. The BSF's release of dramatic unseen footage follows these images released by the army. This is the war room on the night of Operation Sindoor's first strikes at 9 terror bases, a 22-minute action. You can see all the military chiefs in the war room. These images now officially released by the Indian military. All of this video evidence, video documentation, satellite images points to India's successful military triumph in Operation Sindoor, an operation in which international opinion is finally beginning to concede that India was able to achieve our stated objectives. The Prime Minister is in his home state of Gujarat. He has made a number of speeches in the last 24 hours. In his latest speech, he says what Pakistan is doing with its sheltering, harboring, and promoting of terrorism can no longer be called a proxy war. He has referenced the attendance of Pakistani military officials at funerals of terrorists who were killed in Operation Sindoor. There's a lot to talk about, but perhaps there hasn't been as quoted, as respected, as applauded an international piece as the one written by Professor Walter Ladwig, who's, of course, at the King's College in London. I want to welcome him to the program now. Thank you so much, Dr. Walter Ladwig. I want to start by complimenting you on your piece. I literally picked it up like everybody else from the online stratosphere. And I remember posting a comment on social media saying that I thought it was the most nuanced, objective, really, truly independent piece on Operation Sindoor. So thank you so much, and compliments to you for your very granular study of Operation Sindoor. I want to start by asking you to talk a little bit about the arguments that you made in your piece. And you say even more than the reach of this operation was the restraint in particular that India showed on the very first night, how India took on higher operational risk to make sure that India's action against terror bases was not seen as escalatory, was not seen as provoking Pakistan into a larger war. So speak a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. And thank you for the kind words about the piece. The first thing to really note here, and one of the reasons I wanted to write this piece, because I didn't think it was getting enough attention, was the explanation for sort of what happened on day one. And so much of the international media immediately turned its attention to allegations and debates around numbers of aircraft loss without any discussion or analysis of what may have happened and what may have led to that. And it was the mission orders given to the Air Force that their job was to strike the facilities identified as being associated with anti-India terrorist groups, not to provoke a general war with Pakistan, not to start a military engagement with aircraft or air defense systems on the other side. And when you do that, when you choose to do that, you put a significant level of operational risk. You put your pilots at risk. And part of that was to try to, in my opinion, send a very clear message that the target and the objective is to do with these terrorist facilities, not the Pakistani state or military per se.
In fact, let me read out your exact words. I'm going to quote a couple of sentences from your piece. You say India accepted heightened operational risk in pursuit of clear strategic messaging. You then say more impressive than the operation's reach was its restraint on the first day. And you say the talk of losses must be seen against scale and complexity of the mission. Now, this is a very important point because in the first few hours after these strikes against terror bases, the media narrative became all about, these alleged losses. And the Indian Air Force, when asked about this at its military briefing, only said that, look, it's combat. There will be losses, but all our pilots are home. And I think you make a really, really important point about seeing any losses that may have taken place against the complexity of the mission, and the fact that India's pilots who were manning this mission were actually taking a greater risk to their own lives.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I do think, unfortunately, this is one area where then the narrative, control of the narrative or the ability to shape the narrative was lost because there were these counter allegations of aircraft losses and the government did not choose to directly engage with them. It sort of, as I write in the piece, it ceded the space to a range of professional and amateur analysts. And as you probably saw, social media and the print media was flooded with various stories. And instead of focusing on what the Indian Air Force managed to accomplish on the first night, stories were instead framed as duels between Chinese aircraft and French aircraft. And what can we learn from that? And where, going so as far, in some cases, people were asking about, what does this mean for the future of Taiwan? And they were drawing kind of big picture conclusions from fragments of information about what happened in one engagement. And so the media message, I think, then was overtaken.
Let me move on to, in a way, the most significant central core of your argument. And the core of your argument is that India largely achieved all the stated objectives that it had with this operation. You also point out that India was able to penetrate Pakistan's China-supplied air defense system, targeting air bases successfully for the very first time since 1971. And then you write how the Indian Air Force showed capacity for coercive precision operations. Now, what's important to note, as you know, Walter, but just for our larger audience, on the first night, that remarkable restraint that you talk about, action was only targeted at terror bases. And if Pakistan had chosen not to respond to that, not to target Indian airfields or airstrips, cities, places of worship, India was conveying, we're ready to do no more. But then it became this 4-day war where now we know from satellite images that Pakistan's air bases were badly hit, whether it was Noor Khan or Rahim Yar Khan or Sargodha. And we have satellite images that document this. How do you see the significance of what you actually called the IAF, the Indian Air Force, showing capacity for coercive precision operations?
Well, as you described, the ability in the first instance to, as far as we can tell from the outside, precisely strike facilities that intelligence had identified as being associated with anti-India terrorist groups. And then when the conflict expanded into more of a military versus military, the ability to do so across a range of Pakistani air defense and air bases. We saw the employment of a range of capabilities that the Indian Air Force had been building up for some time, but were certainly new to operational use. So the combination of standoff strike missiles and bombs, in addition to the use of so-called loitering munitions, sometimes referred to as kamikaze drones, which were all employed to what appears to be great effect.
So let's look at the larger picture now. And I think that's the really interesting documentation of, in your piece. You point out that India was able to achieve the stated strategic objectives. You point out that there was restraint shown on the first night when terror bases were targeted. And you point out that in a way, it has been a quiet signaling of strategic resolve. So there was a lot of noise in the ether in the first couple of days. And then, of course, our military started speaking much more granularly, perhaps, than it had been earlier. You call this the new normal. And you basically say that cross-border action in response to the shielding of terrorism in Pakistan, cross-border response will now not be the exception, it will be the expectation, right? And I think you get this absolutely right. And the Prime Minister has said this repeatedly in the last week or so, that this is now going to be our response every time. What do you think the world and some of the Western media is missing here in its understanding of this? Because, to the annoyance of many people here, and this is across political lines, there is a continued framing of this as some sort of dispute of equivalence between India and Pakistan, that this is somehow still being framed as a Kashmir issue. Whereas for India, India is signaling to the world, is saying to the world, if Pakistan harbors groups like the Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, if these men are allowed to operate with impunity, if they hurt India, we will use kinetic action. Are you able to hear me, Walter?
I think I seem to have lost connection for...
Okay, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Are you able to hear me?
Hello?
Yeah, are you able to hear me?
Okay, now I can hear you. I'm afraid I lost connection for that.
Sure, no problem. I'll just repeat that for you. I was just making the point that to the annoyance of many Indians across political affiliations, large sections of the Western media and Western think tanks continue to frame this as some sort of dispute over Kashmir. These are countries that are fighting over Kashmir, whereas India very clearly sees this to be about terrorism and is signaling to the world that every time groups like the Lashkar, the Jaish are given safe harbor, are allowed to operate with impunity, kinetic action will now be the new normal. What do you think the West is missing in its understanding of what's just happened here?
Well, it's very interesting because I think there have been a range of rather nuanced responses. So certainly in the immediate aftermath of the April attack, countries around the world expressed sort of sympathy and solidarity with India, made statements against terrorism. And then when Operation Sindoor begun, although publicly there were some countries that seemed to default back to the, we call on both sides for restraint. My understanding is that privately, a number of India's partners in the world expressed the view that, we understand what you need to do, we appreciate what you need to do. And I think in general, the, India gets the benefit of the doubt in these kinds of situations, in the sense that the history of Pakistan's involvement with terrorism is well known. As I pointed out in the piece, just to sort of remind audiences about Osama bin Laden also being in Pakistan, so this isn't just about India's concerns. And so I think, though, this is a very important issue for the Indian government and the Indian strategic community to take forward, although the Prime Minister has signaled that, if the Indian government in the future is not necessarily going to feel that the burden of proof lies with it to sort of conclusively demonstrate all the links in the chain from a terrorist attack back to what they believe are state-based agents in Pakistan. I think it is still important to try to make those arguments and make those cases to be able to continually remind people in the international community about the terrorism, about the links to terrorism, because the default is to, I think, always go back to arguments or discussions of root causes, and that sort of then leads people to want to talk about Kashmir rather than terrorism.
Absolutely. You write in your piece, preventing the next Sindoor or the next 2611 will require sustained international pressure. The point is that this is a complicated context because India will not accept mediation. India has pushed back against Donald Trump's repeated claims of taking credit for the halt in hostilities. India has said repeatedly that we made it very clear that the Pakistani Director General of Military Operations would have to call his counterpart in India. But at the same time, India does want the world to understand Pakistan's patronage of terrorism. Do you believe that the world gets that? Do you believe that the world gets that? Are you able to hear me, Walter?
Sorry, I lost you for a second. I got the tail end of the question. Do you want to restart?
Yeah, just that you say in your piece that preventing the next Sindoor or the next 2611 requires sustained international pressure, right? And
Yes.
I was pointing to the sort of complexity where India will not accept mediation and has pushed back against Donald Trump's claims on this, but at the same time wants the world to remember Osama bin Laden, wants the world to remember that Daniel Pearl was killed by the Jaish-e-Mohammed and he was released as a result of a passenger plane being hijacked from India, because of which India was forced to release 3 terrorists in our custody, including Jaish-e-Mohammed's chief, Masood Azhar. So, do you believe that the world is still a little bit in denial? Earlier, it used to be said that Pakistan, is given a long pass because of Western interests in Afghanistan. That state surely should be behind us. Explain a little bit about what you mean when you say that sustained international pressure is needed.
Well, I think that that era is behind us. If you look in Washington D.C., I think attitudes towards Pakistan across the U.S. government, at best you would find indifference. At worst, you would find a sustained hostility from those in the military, intelligence, and diplomatic communities who spent the better part of the last 2 decades in Afghanistan and saw the sort of double dealing of Pakistani counterparts up close. I think, it's remarkable. You saw the British Foreign Secretary make statements about terrorism and the need to take serious action. I don't think people are blind to this. There
Mhm.
is not a reason to look the other way. There are, at times calculations I think that might differ from India's. So, for example, with questions on the state of the Pakistani economy and the IMF, nobody wants to see the country collapse. No one thinks that that is going to be in anyone's interest. So there are times in which there might be decisions that are made. I'm sure Indian diplomats would say that future IMF aid should be conditioned
Mhm.
on requirements in this and that. And those are conversations I think should definitely happen. It may not always win the argument, but I'm hoping that part of what these various delegations of MPs who are traveling the world is doing is sort of reinforcing this message and providing kind of the same types of evidence that various ambassadors and high commissioners did around the world during the time of the conflict itself.
Now, Walter, one of the things our Prime Minister has repeatedly said, Prime Minister Modi has repeatedly said, is that India will not surrender to nuclear blackmail any longer. And your piece makes the very important point that the conflict was possibly more contained and restrained than initially seemed. And the reason it seemed, and I can say this because I was on the ground reporting, it seemed like an all-out war because of drone fights in the air and missiles being intercepted and shelling, heavy mortar shelling coming into villages along the line of control in the international border. But the point that you're making is that despite Donald Trump's repeated comments on the possibility or the danger of nuclear war, you believe that this was a conflict that was very firmly under the nuclear threshold. And in that sense, it indicates a brand new normal that the world needs to wrap its mind around.
So I think what it demonstrated is there's much more space under the nuclear umbrella for conventional conflict than we previously realized. And what we've got to understand here is this is completely new territory for the world, for academics who study conflict. We have no examples in history of two nuclear armed neighbors who carried out sustained airstrikes against each other. So what we know and what we understand from past conflicts doesn't necessarily capture the realities on the ground in South Asia. And I think it also, some of the reaction from around the world, um, to a certain extent, presumes that leaders and decision makers in South Asia are reckless or irresponsible, and I think that's incredibly unfair. I think there is a recognition and an understanding of the significant risks and the significant danger, which is why we saw, in my opinion, both sides really focus their strikes on military targets, really focus their use of specific assets that might be less escalatory, and that when there was an opportunity to take advantage of an off ramp that was presented, both sides were okay to move towards that.
Mhm. Why do you think Pakistan was, in your understanding, the reading here is that when the air bases, and you do mention this in your piece, when the China supplied air defense systems were successfully penetrated, that proved to be, in a way, the turning point. And then, the Americans were told, look, can you talk to the Indians? The Americans try and talk to the Indians. We say, tell them to call us. Their Director General of Military Operations calls us, and there is a halt. Now, do you believe the turning point was the penetration of Pakistan's air defense?
I think it was a significant wake up call. One of the things, it's not an original point. A number of my colleagues have made this previously, but one of the things that still continues to puzzle me is why the Pakistani military and government was not willing to declare victory from their perspective on the first evening. Right? If this had all been brought to a close and they could, celebrate the alleged downing of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, however many they say aircraft they brought down, and minimize the Indian strike, I think we might have a very different narrative here. But the conflict did go forward, and when the IAF deployed its suite of capabilities and also operated according to more traditional Air Force doctrines, which is to say that you suppress enemy air defenses and you clear the airspace and so forth, that they were highly successful. And I think maybe it was a bit of hubris after the first night. I don't know for sure, but the fact that the range of strikes that was able to be carried out, and the range of munitions that managed to get through, I think probably signaled that we don't want this to continue.
Yeah. I think they did try the first night to deflect the conversation to, what had happened in the air with allegations of India's aircraft. To be clear, India's official position remains that there will be losses in a combat, but all pilots have come home. And so that is the access to the information we have. But certainly Pakistan did try attempt to deflect the narrative. But look at what's happened in Pakistan in the last week. The Pakistan Army Chief has been elevated to the rank of Field Marshal. This makes the Pakistan Army stronger than ever before, the civilians weaker than ever before. Images are now available in the public domain of Pakistani military officials attending the funeral of terrorists who were killed in this operation. And finally, Walter, not just from the Osama bin Laden example, but anyone who studies Pakistan will know that terror groups like the Lashkar and the Jaish are terrorist outfits that have never once inflicted an act of terror within Pakistan. So when Pakistan does say, we're also victims of terror, these two groups are two prime examples of terrorist outfits that have never targeted the people of Pakistan. They are seen to be assets of the Pakistani deep state. So do you think there's an absence of granular understanding, even though the United Kingdom, for example, if I'm not wrong, proscribed the Lashkar-e-Taiba as a terror group as far back as 2001?
Yes, absolutely. So I think, again, among people who follow this closely, who do study the region, diplomats and scholars, the appreciation of the different ways in which the Pakistani state deals with terrorist and insurgent groups in terms of fighting some, ignoring some, and partnering with some, I think is well understood. When you go to more broadly to the public and the population, less so, and hence then why these narratives of we've suffered more from terrorism than any other country tend to resonate, I think, with publics, even though they necessarily get a skeptical view from people who kind of understand the situation more granularly, as you say.
Finally, what for you is your biggest takeaway from this operation? And as you said, those who study conflict haven't quite seen anything like this. So there's a new template of, even academic analysis that is now going to be brought to understanding this region. What do you take away above everything else from Operation Sindoor?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. One, as I've already mentioned, is the idea of there being more space than popularly conceived of before under the nuclear threshold for conventional operations. Not that we hope to see them, but that there is potentially more kind of stability and space. I think, secondly, is to do with an understanding of the evolving capabilities of the Indian Air Force, the Pakistani Air Force, French equipment, Chinese equipment. I think this will be something that scholars and analysts will be poring over for some time to come. And then, projecting forward to the future, assuming that I'm correct and in taking the prime minister at his word that this is the new normal, what this will look like in the future in terms of the fact that next time around, it won't be so simple. Prescribed groups are going to know that their facilities will be targeted, that their known areas of operation will be focused on. So it will become an even more difficult game of cat and mouse, if you will, to first identify the correct places to go after. And the Pakistani military, which may have been caught off guard in 2019, certainly was on sort of continuous operations and patrol, waiting for something to happen in 2025. I think it will be even more prepared in the future. So this policy won't be without challenges, and so watching how this evolves and how the government prepares for that will be quite fascinating to see.
Well, just to say in the end, the Prime Minister in a speech today said that this can no longer be called a proxy war. For decades, we have said that Pakistan has conducted a proxy war using terrorists. He now has ended the perception of a distinction between the Pakistani state and terrorists who operate from Pakistani soil. And that's, I think, the really big dramatic shift that Operation Sindoor does mark. Professor Walter Ladwig, again, congratulations on your analysis, a truly granular and nuanced piece. For anyone who hasn't read it, we link it in the description below so you can have a full read of that piece. And we hope to talk to you again soon. Walter, thank you very much and take care.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.